Today in Kinesiology 2, we will be studying Chapter 9, Muscles. This is Part 3 and the final part of our muscle definitions. We're going to go over muscle roles. So think of it just as that, a role, like a play. So we've got the agonist, the synergist, the antagonist, neutralizer and fixator, and the supporter. And as we look over at the cloud on the right, this is crucial for our clinical work. Muscles are not stuck in one role. A muscle might start a movement as the agonist, but as the joint angle changes, it might hand that job off and become a synergist or a fixator. When you're palpating a client, you need to feel for those shifts. So if a client has a tight muscle, always look at the antagonist. If the antagonist isn't letting go, the agonist has to work twice as hard to do its job. So sometimes the victim is the one hurting, but the villain is the muscle on the opposite side that just won't relax. So all of this will play together. We're going to zero in on our main character, which is the agonist. In any given movement, this is a prime mover. It is the muscle, or sometimes a group of muscles, that is primarily responsible for producing a specific action. So we're going to take a look at the diagram of the back here. When we want to shrug our shoulders, or more technically, elevate the scapula, the upper trapezius is the agonist. It's doing the bulk of the concentric contraction to make the movement happen. So as therapists, when a client says, "It hurts when I do this," your first thought should be, what is the agonist of that movement? That's often where the work begins, but as we'll see in the next few slides, the agonist doesn't work in a vacuum. So if an agonist is chronically turned on or hypertonic, it's going to fatigue very quickly. So when you see someone with their shoulders up to their ears because of stress, that's the upper trap acting as constant agonist for a movement that shouldn't be happening. And we have to teach that muscle how to stop being the star of the show for a minute. So moving on with our theme of roles in a play, if the agonist is our lead actor, the synergist is the supporting cast. These are the muscles that assist the prime mover to get the job done. While they aren't quite as powerful or effective at creating that specific main action on their own, the movement wouldn't be as smooth or as strong if we didn't have them. So looking back to the example of shrugging or scapular elevation, while the trapezius is the star of the show, the levator scapulae and the rhomboids are right there helping pull the shoulder blades up. In your practice, you'll often find that when a prime mover gets injured or fatigued, these synergists try to take over the whole job. And we call that synergistic dominance. And it's a recipe for stubborn knots that your clients complain about. And when you think, if you've ever had a client whose neck is stuck and the levator scapulae feels like a guitar string, often it's because the trapezius isn't doing its fair share of the work. And the poor little synergist is exhausted from trying to be the hero. So to fix the neck, you sometimes have to wake up the traps so that they all work together. Now we meet the antagonist. This is the muscle that performs the action exactly opposite to our agonist. For a movement to smoothly happen, the antagonist usually has to lengthen and give way while the agonist shortens. Using the upper shoulder shrug again, if the upper trapezius is pulling the scapula up, the lower trapezius is the antagonist, and it has to relax to allow that elevation. However, if you look at the second bullet point, co-contraction, this is a term you'll use a lot in clinical practice. If both the agonist and the antagonist contract at the same time, Nobody wins the tug of war. You just get isometric contraction. This isn't a mistake by the body. It's actually how we create stabilization. So if you're carrying a heavy box, your agonist and antagonist are co-contracting to lock that joint in place so you don't drop the load. And this is the brakes and gas analogy. If you're trying to drive with your foot on the gas, which is the agonist, and the emergency brake, the antagonist, you're going to burn out the engine. In massage, we often spend our time releasing the brakes so the client can move again without that internal resistance. Now we're getting into the damage control team, the neutralizer or fixator. Most muscles have more than one action because of the way they cross a joint. Our friend the upper trapezius doesn't just elevate the shoulders, it also wants to extend the head and neck. But what if you just want to shrug your shoulders without tilting your head back? That's where the neutralizer comes in. In this example, the SCM contracts just enough to fix the neck in place, canceling out that unwanted secondary action of the trap. It acts like a stabilizer, making sure that the force of the agonist only goes exactly where we want it. Without fixators, our movements would be messy and imprecise. So, in your clinical work, if a client has mystery neck pain that won't go away, check their shoulder mechanics. If their fixators, like the SCM, are working overtime to stabilize the messy shoulder movement, they're going to be chronically tight. You can't just rub the SCM, you have to fix the reason it's overworking in the first place. Moving on to the supporters. While the agonist is the star and the synergist are the supporting actors, the supporters are like the stage itself. They provide the foundation that allows the whole production to happen. A supporter doesn't necessarily cross the joint where the movement is happening. Instead, it works further away to keep the rest of the body stable. Think about it like this. If you go to shrug your shoulders, but your core and hips are like mush, your whole torso would collapse under the effort. And as you see in the diagram, when that upper trap pulls up, muscles all the way down the spine and into the hips engage. They are the supporting role. Your posture, so the scapula has a solid frame to move against. So movement is never just local, it's a whole body event. So this is why we always say, look away from the pain. A client might have shoulder pain, but if their supporters in the low back or hips are weak, the shoulder has to work 10 times harder to stay stable. If the foundation is shaky, the roof is going to leak. So always check the foundation. Keep that in mind. Now that we know the roles, you might be wondering what decides which muscle gets to play the agonist and which is just a supporter. It's not random, it's anatomy. So there are 4 major factors that dictates a muscle's potential. We have size, shape and design, location, and line of pull. And as a therapist, understanding these factors help us realize why a small muscle like a rotator cuff muscle should never be trying to do the job of a big muscle like the deltoids. And when they do, that's when injury happens. Here we're looking at how size dictates the hierarchy of movement. Generally, the body is efficient. It uses the biggest tools for the biggest job. Larger muscles with more mass and more motor units will dominate the action. We're taking a look at the diagram for elbow flexion. Most people think the biceps brachii is the star of the show, but if you look at the brachialis, it is a deep, thick muscle that sits right under the biceps. And because of its size and its specific attachment points, it's actually the agonist or the prime mover for flexing the elbow. The smaller muscles you see highlighted, like the pronator teres and flexor carpi radialis, are the synergists. They help, but they simply don't have the bulk to do the primary force. So if the brachialis were to fail or become inhibited, these smaller muscles would have to work overtime to keep the elbow moving, which leads to strain. So if you think of this like a construction site, the brachialis is the heavy duty crane, and the pronator teres is a guy with a ladder. If the crane breaks down and you ask the guy on the ladder to lift the steel beams, he's going to get injured pretty fast. So when you find tennis elbow or forearm strain, ask yourself, is the heavy lifter doing its job, or are the little guys trying to carry the whole load? Next, we look at shape and design. Think of this as the engineering of the body. A muscle's physical shape tells you exactly where the force is coming from. So we're going to look at the rhomboids shown here because they are flat and the fibers run at a diagonal angle from the spine to the scapula. They don't just do one thing. That diagonal design allows them to pull the shoulder blade up, rotate it downward, and pull it back toward the spine. If those fibers ran perfectly horizontal, they'd only be able to retract. But it's not just the muscle, the joint shape matters too. You can have the strongest muscle in the world, but if the joint is a hinge like the elbow or knee, it's mostly only going to allow for flexion and extension. The muscle has to work within the limits of the hardware it's attached to. So this is why we need to visualize the fibers under the skin. When you're working on the rhomboids, don't just rub up and down, follow the diagonal design. If you work with the grain of the muscle's architecture, you're going to get much better results than if you're just scrubbing across it aimlessly. Looking at location, and the sartorius is the perfect example of how real estate dictates function. Because this muscle crosses both the hip and the knee joints, it has influence on both. Notice how it winds across the thigh like a seatbelt. At the hip, it helps you flex, rotate outward, and move the leg away from the midline. At the knee, it helps with flexion and rotating that knee inward. This is the muscle that literally allows you to sit cross-legged, which is why it's also nicknamed the tailor's muscle, because tailors would sit in a cross-legged position when they were working. Now, even though it does all of these cool things, it is a synergist. It's too thin to be the prime mover for any of these actions on its own. It's the ultimate helper muscle, weaving movement together. So when a client has pain on the inner side of the knee at the pes anserinus, don't just look at the knee. You have to trace the sartorius all the way back up to the ASIS on the hip. If the hip is out of alignment, it's pulling on that strap and causing knee pain. Everything is connected by the path the muscle takes. We're going to call this the tug of war slide. So we're going to talk about line of pull. Think of a muscle like the rope in this picture. When the dog pulls, the force travels in a very specific direction along that rope. Muscles are no different. They can only pull in the direction that their fibers are laid out. So we categorize these lines to understand the complexity of a movement. So we have one line, which is a simple pull in one direction. Brachialis is a good example of that. Two or multiple lines, and think of the pectoralis major or the deltoids, because the fibers fan out. They can pull from different angles depending on which part of the muscle fires. The multiple joints, like we saw in the sartorius or the tailor's muscle, where the line of pull crosses several axes of motion. So when you're assessing a client, you have to look at how they are pulling. If the body's rope is misaligned or pulling from a weird angle, it creates stress on the joints. Your job is to help restore that natural, efficient line of pull. And I love this picture of the dog because it shows tension. In massage, your hands are the other end of that rope. If you want to lengthen a muscle, you have to pull exactly opposite to its natural line of pull. If you're off by even a few degrees, you're just pushing tissue around instead of actually creating a release. So I've showed you at different times where I've been helping you work on the back, and when we pull in the opposite way, it actually feels so much better instead of so pulling medially on the lats instead of pushing laterally can actually help that muscle just as much. So this makes line of pull a little easier to visualize. We're going to look at the little guys working on the shoulder areas. And on the left, we have one line. There's a single person pulling a single rope. This muscle has one primary job: flexion. It's straightforward, it's direct, and the force only goes in one direction. Now, if we look at the image on the right, two lines. Here we have two different people pulling ropes attached to the same arm. One is pulling for flexion and the other is pulling for adduction. When they both pull at the same time, the arm moves in a diagonal path between those 2 points. This is exactly how a muscle like your pectoralis major works. Depending on which fibers are pulling at the moment, you might get a different combination of movements. The body uses these direct lines to pull to create the smooth, complex motions that we use every day. So when you're treating a muscle with multiple lines of pull, you can't just treat it like a single strip. You have to address all the different people pulling those ropes. If you only release the flexion fibers but leave the adduction fibers tight, your client is still going to feel restricted. So think of it like tuning a guitar. You have to check every string to get the harmony just right. If you thought the last slide was busy, this one is over the top. This is where we see the true versatility of the human body. On the left, we have multiple lines. The deltoid is the classic example here because it wraps around the shoulder like a cap. It has pullers on all sides. And depending on which part of the deltoid contracts, you can get 5 or 6 different movements out of a single muscle. This is why a client might have no pain with abduction, but it catches when they try to rotate. Only one specific line of pull is affected. And on the right, we see multiple joints. This is what happens when a muscle crosses more than one hinge. You have one person pulling at the elbow for flexion, while others are pulling at the wrist for extension and abduction. When you have a muscle like this, every joint it crosses is affected by its tension. You can't fix the wrist without looking at what's happening at the elbow. In clinic, when you're working on these complex muscles, you have to be a little bit of a detective. If the multiple lines are out of whack, the muscles start pulling the joint out of its socket slightly, leading to that grinding feeling. So when you release those specific lines, you aren't just relaxing a muscle, you're recentering the joint. And always remember, where the rope pulls, the bone follows, which is why stability is so important. Okay, now we're getting into excursion, and you need to think of excursion as the range of a muscle. Every muscle has a limit on how far it can shorten and how far it can stretch. The general rule of thumb is that a muscle can change its length by about half of its resting state. So if a muscle is at 6 inches at rest, it can contract down to 3 inches, or it can stretch out to 9 inches. This range is vital for movement, but it leads us to 2 very important clinical terms: active and passive insufficiency. Active insufficiency is when a muscle is shortened so much that it can't create any more force. It's bunched up and has nowhere left to go. And then we have passive insufficiency. It's the opposite. The muscle is stretched to its max across multiple joints and simply just can't move any further. So as a massage therapist, when you're moving a client's limb, you need to know if the stop you feel is a joint issue or just a muscle reaching its limit of excursion. So, have you ever tried to make a fist while your wrist is fully flexed? It's hard, right? That active insufficiency, your finger flexors are already shortened at the wrist, but they can't contract enough to close your hand. We use this in the treatment room to isolate specific muscles. If we want to take one muscle out of the game to work on another, we purposefully put it into a state of insufficiency. So we're going to dig deeper into active insufficiency. This primarily happens with our multi-joint muscles. So look at this diagram of the arm. So when we flex the elbow, flex the wrist, and then try to make a tight fist, we are putting those flexor muscles in a maximum shortened state. The muscles literally bunched up at every joint it crosses. And because it's already so contracted, it loses its leverage. It simply cannot apply any more force effectively. In this position, your grip strength will be significantly lower than if your wrist was straight. The flexion chain has been weakened because the muscles have ran out of room to pull. And as an LMT, you'll see this when clients have weakness in certain movements. Often it's not that the muscle is truly weak, it's just being asked to work from a position of active insufficiency. So short is not strong. Just because a muscle is in a shortened position doesn't mean it's doing its job well. If a client spends all day at a computer with their wrists and elbows flexed, those flexors are chronically shortened. And when they go to pick up something heavy, they might feel a twinge or a weakness because they're trying to generate force from a state of active insufficiency. So again, short does not mean that it is strong. Now we have passive insufficiency. If active insufficiency was about being too bunched up, passive insufficiency is about being tethered or stretched way too thin. So we're going to look at the diagram, and if we try to extend the wrist and the fingers at the same time, the flexors on the opposite side, again remember that's the antagonist, have to lengthen. But because they cross the elbow, the wrist, and the fingers, they eventually run out of slack. They reach their maximum excursion and simply cannot stretch any further. This tether effect stops the movement, which we call weakness in ROM, or range of motion. You can test yourself right now, so just relax your arm on the desk, and if you press into your forearm flexors, you'll see your fingers naturally curl up. That's because you're creating tension in that tether, and the muscle has to pull the joints together to find some slack. And I see this when I work on clients all the time. So this is why we always check for tightness by looking at the opposite side. If your client can't fully extend their wrist, don't just work on the extensors to make them stronger. The problem is usually passive insufficiency in the flexors. They're too short to allow the movement to happen. You have to lengthen before the limb can move freely. We're going to take everything we learned about insufficiency and apply it to the whole body. We categorized muscles into two main groups, postural and phasic. Postural muscles are designed to hold us up against gravity all day long, while phasic muscles are for movement. When these two groups get out of balance, we see postural distortions, as it's shown on this slide. Look at the kyphosis, otherwise it's also known as sway back example. And in these cases, certain muscle groups have become chronically shortened or active insufficiency, while the muscles on the opposite side are being pulled into a state of chronic stretch, which is passive insufficiency. This isn't just a bad habit, it's a physical imbalance where the muscles have literally adapted to a distorted length. And as an LMT, your goal isn't just to massage the back, It's to identify which muscles are tethers and which ones have been stretched to their limit. So, posture is the silent language of the body. When you see a client with kyphosis, so that rounded upper back area, don't just spend 60 minutes on their back muscles. Those muscles are actually the victims. They're overstretched and exhausted. The villains are usually the chest muscles, the pecs, that are too short and pulling everything forward. So to fix the back, you often have to open up the front. Let's meet the workhorses of the body, the postural muscles. These muscles are designed for endurance. Their main job is support, keeping you upright and stabilizing your joints so you just don't collapse into a heap on the floor. Because of their role, they're designed to live in a semi-contracted state for long periods. So think of your calves, your hip flexors, or your upper traps. They don't get tired easily, but they have a downside. If they're overused, or even worse, if they are held in one position for too long without being stretched, they become hyperactive, which means they forget how to relax. They stay shortened and tight, which is hypertonic, even when you're trying to rest. These are muscles that feel like rocks under your hands during massage. So when you're working on postural muscles, remember that they are often stubborn. They've been on the on position for years. You just can't bully them into relaxing with deep pressure in 5 minutes. You have to use techniques that talk to the nervous system and tell these muscles it's okay, you can let go now. But regular stretching for these specific examples is the only way to keep them from turning into permanent tethers. So relay that to your client. That would be their homework. Phasic muscles are designed for big, powerful movements like throwing a ball, jumping, or lifting a heavy box. They're designed to contract fully and then relax. And because they use so much energy, they do fatigue very quickly. They aren't meant to be on all day. However, in our modern world, we often demand way too much of them. And when we overwork these muscles without giving them a chance to recover, they don't get tight like postural muscles do. Instead, they become hypotonic, meaning they get long, overstretched, and weak. So if you look at this diagram, these are often the muscles of the glutes, the rhomboids, and the abdominal wall. When they give up and become weak, the postural muscles have to try and take over their job, which is a recipe for total body imbalance. So in your sessions, you'll often find that the pain is in these long, overstretched phasic muscles. Your instinct might be to stretch them even more because they hurt, but that's the last thing they need. If a muscle is already overstretched and weak or hypotonic, it needs activation and blood flow, not more lengthening. You have to wake these muscles up so they can start supporting the body again. Again, remember, not everything needs to be lengthened and stretched. We've talked about this a lot lately. I just want to reiterate that. Here's the perfect real-world example of everything we've been discussing. So forward head posture. Notice the lines on these diagrams. When the head shifts forward, the center of gravity moves and the body has to compensate. On the front side, our postural muscles, which are the pec major and the pec minor, they've become short and tight. They are essentially winning the tug of war, pulling the shoulders forward and down. Meanwhile, on the back side, our phasic muscles, the rhomboids, and the mid to lower portions of the trapezius have become long and weak. They're exhausted from trying to pull the weight of the head back against gravity. This is a classic muscle imbalance. You can't just fix this by telling someone to stand up straight. You have to physically address the length of the tissue on both sides. So when a client comes in with a headache or pain between the shoulder blades, they're going to want you to dig into those rhomboids because that's where it hurts. But remember, those rhomboids are the victim of passive insufficiency. If you only work on the back, the pain will be back before they even get to their car. You must open up those postural muscles in the chest to give the back muscles a chance to shorten and regain their strength. It's very important. So this is where we bring it all together. We call this X marks the spot because when you draw an X through the major joints, the lines show you exactly which muscles are battling each other. So notice the pattern. If the hip flexors are short and tight, that's the red line. Then the glutes on the opposite side are usually long and weak. That's the blue line. This is lower crossed syndrome. But the body is a chain. If the pelvis is tilted because those tight hips, the upper body has to compensate. This leads to upper crossed syndrome, where the chest is tight and the back is overstretched. As the slide says, guarding and compensations are the name of the game. If you only treat the neck but ignore the pelvis, you're just chasing the pain all around the body. You have to look at both X patterns to truly balance out your client. And think of the body like a tent. If one rope is being pulled too taut, the whole tent leans. You can't just keep tightening the other rope to fix the lean. You have to find the one that's too short and let it out. When you see a client walk in, try to see those red and blue lines, and it will tell you exactly where the work needs to start if you pay attention. Physics of myofascial units. To understand why some muscles feel weak even if they are healthy, we have to look at two physical laws: force length and force velocity. First, force length. A muscle has an ideal length where it can produce the most power. If it's too stretched or too bunched up, it loses its ability to create tension. Think of a rubber band. If it's already been stretched to its limit, you can't get much more snap out of it. Second, force velocity. This is the relationship between how fast a muscle contracts and how much force it can produce. Generally, the faster a muscle shortens, the less force it can generate. This is why you can't sprint at full speed while carrying a 100-pound backpack. Your muscles need time to build up the force required for that load. So this explains why our posture talk matters so much. If a client's muscle is chronically out of its ideal length because of their posture, it physically cannot produce maximum force. They aren't just being lazy, their physics are off. When we bring the body back into alignment, we are actually restoring the muscle's ability to generate that power efficiently. Here we're going to look at action with the quads. Most people think a muscle is strongest when it's fully contracted, but physics tell us otherwise. Look at mid-range image at the bottom. This is where the muscle has the most cross bridges available to grab onto each other and pull. It's the sweet spot for generating maximum force. When the knee is fully flexed, which is the top left, the quad is stretched out like a rubber band pulled to its limit. It has high tension, but it's hard to start the movement from there. When the knee is fully extended, which is the top right, the muscle is so shortened that it's bunched up. That again is active insufficiency, and it can't pull much further. In your massage practice, this is why positioning matters. So if you're trying to test a muscle's strength or even palpate its tone, you'll get the most accurate read when the joint is in its neutral mid-range position. So it's kind of like a handshake. If someone is standing 10 feet away, you can't reach them because it's lengthened. If they are hugging you, you have no room to move at all. So that's shortened. But if they are right in front of you, you can give a good, strong squeeze. When you're working on a client, always look at the joint angle. If it's an extreme, you're fighting physics, and the muscle won't even allow you to start before you even get started. Force and velocity is a concept that is very easy to feel, but harder to explain without the physics. Basically, there is an inverse relationship between how fast a muscle moves and how much force it can create. So look at the person doing a bicep curl. If you pick up a 5-pound dumbbell, you can curl it very quickly. But if you pick up a 50-pound dumbbell, your velocity or speed slows down significantly. Why is that? It's because the muscle needs more time for the microscopic fibers, those cross bridges, to connect and pull together to create the force needed to move that heavy load. The slower the engagement, the more tension the muscle can actually produce. So if you move too fast, those fibers don't have time to grab on, and the muscle actually produces less tension. So, this is the secret sauce of massage therapy. If you're doing deep tissue work and you move your hands too fast, the client's muscles won't have time to engage, or more importantly, to relax into the stroke. By slowing down your velocity, you allow for deeper tension and for better neurological response. In our world, slow is deep, and if you want to create real change in the tissue, you have to respect the force velocity rule and take your time. This is why I always say massage with intention. Really think about those movements and the slow and methodical movements.